Howdy ho, neighbors. It's about 32, 34 degrees here in Austin, Texas today. It's pretty cold. And the weather app says it's going to get down to 9 degrees on Monday. And so now I'm wondering if I'm going to be able to do this in the car. I might have to pick a different spot, or maybe I'll drive around in my car and get it warmed up first. I don't know. Anywho, I wanted to give you a little personal update on this effort that I've been making in this whole channel to improve my ability to speak. I was kind of discouraged because yesterday I went back and looked at some of my earlier videos and then some of my more recent videos, and I really haven't made any improvement. And so I started Googling around about some of my difficulties, and I came across what's called aphasia. And aphasia is this inability or this difficulty some people have with speaking, or just finding the words to express their thoughts and stuff like that. And the stuff I read sounded a lot like the problem I was having, and so I started wondering if maybe I have aphasia. And then, of course, I'm one of those people that can read, anything on WebMD and start thinking I've got it. I'm one of those people. So it could be a situation like that. But anyway, there were two causes that they mentioned to three causes. One was strokes, and I haven't had any strokes. Another is a slow-growing tumor. That one would make sense because this inability I've had to speak, I haven't always had this inability. It's gradually just gotten worse over the years. And so that would make sense if I had a slow-growing tumor. The other one was just dementia. Hopefully I don't have dementia, or hopefully I don't develop dementia. Hopefully I don't have a tumor. So anywho, if you're the Christian sort, pray for me because I'm a little concerned about it. Okay, that's it for the personal stuff. Let's go ahead and talk about today's subject. 2 videos ago, I made an argument for moral realism, the idea that there are objective moral values that exist independently of human preference or human belief or whatever. And the video after that, I answered objections. In today's video, I want to make an argument for why there couldn't possibly be any objective moral values unless there was a God. So let's start with a thought experiment. Let's imagine hypothetically that there was no life whatsoever in the universe, and that there was no gods, no spirits, no sentient beings in existence whatsoever. So all you would have is just, atoms moving around, stars burning, planets orbiting, all these kinds of things could be happening and stuff. But it doesn't seem like any of it would matter, because nothing matters unless there's somebody it matters to. And so it doesn't seem like there could be any such thing as value or good, bad, evil. Things would just be, So there couldn't be any obligations if there was nobody to act. So it seems clear that in a universe devoid of sentient beings, that there couldn't be any sort of morality whatsoever, neither objective nor subjective. So now let's populate this hypothetical universe with sentient beings like ourselves. All of a sudden now you've got people that care about other people, and things matter a great deal to them. But you still wouldn't have objective morality, because in that case, it would just matter to those individual sentient beings. And suppose something happens, a building collapses and kills a whole bunch of kids. Well, I may care about that, and you may not care about that. So does it matter or does it not matter? Well, it matters to me, but doesn't matter to you. So there's no objective answer to the question, does it really matter? And if you push it forward and say, okay, let's say that all these sentient beings, all this life and stuff goes on, and it matters a great deal to everybody that exists, and then they cease to exist, and all of a sudden we're back to where we were before. We've just got a universe devoid of life. Well, obviously in that universe, nothing matters. And so there can't be any good, bad, evil, or morality or anything like that. And so that raises the question, if it doesn't matter that any of this ever happened, well, that's the question, really. Since nothing matters now, does it matter that they ever existed at all? Well, it seems like it wouldn't matter, because there'd be nobody for it to matter to. And so if it didn't matter that they ever existed at all, did anything matter while they existed? Well, again, it only matters to those who existed. And since, no individual in creation has any kind of moral authority over anybody else, there can't be any kind of objective meaning or value or purpose or anything like that. It all reduces to individual subjectivism. Even, and I didn't mention this in the earlier video, I don't think I did, but even cultural relativism reduces to individual subjectivism. And the reason is because the only way cultural relativism could hold is if there were some transcendent moral that said you must adhere to the moral code of your society. But if such a thing existed, it would be an objective moral principle. If such a thing does not exist, well, then you have no obligation to adhere to your culture's moral preferences, and therefore morality reduces to individual subjectivism. So, okay, that's one thought experiment, and that shows that without a God, there can't be objective morals. So, the next one is just the very nature of moral imperatives. Morality makes demands on our behavior. It's not like physical laws, which describe the way reality is. Moral laws prescribe the way things ought to be. And so they prescribe behavior. And so they're imperatives. They tell us what we ought to do and what we ought not to do. Well, obviously, you can't have a rule that tells you how you should behave unless there's some legitimate authority that imposes these rules on you. If there's no such authority, you don't have any obligation. Now, we have all kinds of hierarchies in our ordinary lives. Parents have authority over their children. Teachers have authority over their students. Bosses have authority over their employees. Commanders and soldiers. You have governments that have authority over citizens, things like that. So we have all these hierarchies and stuff. And all of them require authorities. Obviously, you couldn't have a civil law if you didn't have a governing authority or something like that. And authorities are always sentient beings. There's no computer, or the universe can't impose this kind of thing on us. So it has to be each other or some sentient being or something like that. And so if you think about the nature of morality, morality is actually the law above all other laws. It's the law by which we judge other laws as being just or unjust. So, for example, if you had a teacher that told you that you must abuse some student, you must insult him or criticize him or do something, say this is just a really bad teacher, and he's ordering you to do a code red. Did y'all see that movie? Gosh, I can't remember it, but it's the one where, what's his name? My aphasia's kicking in now. Tom Cruise and Jack Nicholson. You can't handle the truth. That one. So Jack Nicholson's character had ordered a code red, which means that basically he was ordered to kill this soldier or whatever. Well, that's obviously an immoral thing. Even though it came from a legitimate authority, it's an immoral thing. And so if there were a law that were passed that said, well, you must suffocate your parents when they reach the age of 70, because we no longer want old people in our society. So children are obligated to murder their parents when they turn 70. Well, that would be an immoral law, an unjust law. And so there's this higher law that transcends, all human laws. It's how we were able to judge the Holocaust as being evil. At the Nuremberg trials, the Nazis defended themselves on the basis that they were acting according to their cultural values. They didn't like Jews. But that didn't go over because everybody recognizes, well, there's this law of decency that overrides all your cultural preferences and stuff like that. So if it's true that any law requires some authority, well, then that would be true of the moral law as well. And it would also mean that whoever the authority was that was behind the moral law, it couldn't be any institution, it couldn't be some alien civilization, because they're just created beings like we are. And by created, I'm not implying God created them. I'm just saying they came into existence as part of the natural process of the universe. They're part of the universe, and they're basically on par with us. They're kind of equals in a way. So there has to be some lawgiver that transcends all, human institutions that we can come up with, all hierarchies. It's at the top of all hierarchies. So now the question becomes, what could possibly be different about this being or this person or this authority that gives it that kind of absolute authority and stuff? Well, the moral argument doesn't tell you that. We can speculate based on the moral argument, but we can do better than that. Now, this is an area where different theistic arguments complement each other. We've got the two cosmological arguments I gave before that showed that there's a being that exists necessarily and is the ground of everything else that exists. It's responsible for everything else that exists. Everything else owes its existence to that thing. Well, that, it seems to me, does give us some explanation of how something could have that kind of authority over all of creation. It's because it's all his. And moreover, and when I say his, I'm not implying it's a man. It's just a pronoun for convenience. So this would also mean that this being would have to be absolutely autonomous, because if there were an authority above that being, then that being couldn't be the ultimate source of authority. So this being has to be at the top of all hierarchies. And it would also have to be absolutely sovereign. So they couldn't have peers, equal peers, because if there were other beings, with similar authority, then, it would just reduce to individual subjectivism again. It would be the subjectivism of that being. And I guess, if you think about it, there is a sense in which morality is necessarily subjective. It's subjective in the sense that it must originate with a mind, because only minds value things. So things can only have value to the degree that they are valued by somebody. And so they are subjective in the sense that they originate from a mind, but they're still objective in the sense that I argued in the first video, two videos ago. They're objective in the sense that they don't depend on the individual minds of all the people that exist. They're objective from our point of view because we don't make up those rules. Those rules are imposed on us. It's similar to a situation where, like in elementary school, on the first day of class, the teacher gives you the 10 rules that you have to follow. Don't talk during class, raise your hand if you want to say something, don't beat up the other kids, whatever other rules they are. Well, the teacher came up with those rules, so it's subjective in the sense that she came up with them, but they're objective in the sense that they apply to the kids, and the kids cannot simply opt out of them. Well, morality is the same way. And there are different theories that try to create an objective morality without God. Like, for example, social contract. This is the idea that we all just kind of have this implicit contract with each other. You don't steal my stuff and I won't steal your stuff. You don't kill me and I won't kill you. And that way we can get along and stuff like that. But unless there's some transcendent obligation we have to adhere to this contract, to agree to this contract has no moral force on us. We can simply opt out of it. Now you might say, well, this contract was made before we were born and we were kind of born into it. Sure, but why should we obey it if it's just other people? The only way we could be obligated to obey it is if there's some transcendent rule that says we must obey whatever contract exists. And that would reduce to cultural relativism too, because the rules one culture comes up with may be different than a set of rules another culture comes up with. But I've already argued that there are transcendent moral principles that apply cross-culturally. So social contract won't work. And I guess there are other theories. I can't think of them off the top of my head, but it seems obvious to me that there has to be something very much like a God, a transcendent being who's absolutely autonomous, sovereign, and that has this authority. And if he created the universe, that explains how he could have this kind of authority. So this raises a couple of questions. One of them is, before I go into these objections, let me make an ontological argument for why this God must be good. If you just consider the properties of good and evil, you notice that good is what ought to be done, and evil is what ought not to be done. And that's just true kind of by their definitions. So if all of this originates with, I'm going to go ahead and call it God, because I think at this point, it has to be a God. We're talking about a personal being who created the universe and imposes moral obligations on us. That's a God, at least. It may not be the Christian God yet. I haven't shown that yet, but it at least a God. So I'm going to go ahead and use God now. So if this distinction between good and evil, right and wrong, and all this kind of stuff originates with God, then it shows that God only prefers the good, or only prefers that we do the good and the right and the virtuous, and he never prefers the evil. Then God must be wholly good. He must be the standard by which good is defined. And so it's impossible for God to be anything but good, it seems like. So that raises two questions. One of them is, what does it mean to say that God is good? It seems like the way I've argued for the goodness of God, it makes it sound like it's just a tautology. Saying God is good is just like saying God is God. And surely good means more than that. Well, I came up with two analogies. One of them, there used to be in France, in some vault, this ball of iridium atoms that was considered the standard by which we defined the kilogram. It was called the big K, or the big kilogram, or something like that. And so it seems to me it's meaningful to ask, well, how much mass does the big K have? Well, it has 1 kilogram. That's not a meaningless thing to say. I mean, just because it defines what the kilogram is. The other is a meter, I think, is defined as the distance light travels in a vacuum in such and such many seconds. So it's like a tiny fraction of a second. And that's how you define the length of a meter. Well, suppose I came along and asked you, well, how far does a beam of light travel in such and such seconds? Well, the answer would be 1 meter. That's not a meaningless thing to say. But I think when people say God is good, they do mean more than just God is the standard of goodness. I think they also, people kind of have a gut response to that. They have this idea of what goodness is. They have this idea that kindness, grace, these kinds of things are good. And they see that God has these properties, and so they say, well, God must be good because he has these good properties, these properties that they recognize as being good. Now, that's not the definition of goodness. That's just kind of a I guess the is of predication. You're predicating goodness of God in that situation. Okay, the other issue is the Euthyphro dilemma, or the Euthyphro dilemma. I don't know which way it's supposed to be pronounced. And so this is a question that came up in one of Plato's dialogues. And he said, or somebody in there said, is something good because the gods desire it or prefer it? Or do they prefer it because it's good already? Well, if you say they prefer it because it's good already, then goodness must be something that's over and above gods. There must be some standard above the gods. And if you say that it's good because they desire it, well, then you're saying that they just created goodness. And if you say they created goodness, then that makes goodness seem arbitrary, because they could have just decided something else was good. They could have decided mother stabbing and father raping were good, and it would have been good. Now, I brought this up 2 videos ago, this objection. Now, first of all, let me say that I do not take the horn of the dilemma that says that God commands things because they're good, because I think that God himself is the standard of goodness. So let's look at this other horn of the dilemma, that something is good because God said so. This makes it seem like goodness is arbitrary, because it makes it seem like things could have been otherwise, which seems absurd. Well, the fact that it seems absurd is owing to the fact that, in fact, God has not. Like, say God has forbidden us to eat our mothers. I should probably use examples that aren't quite so gruesome. Let's say God has forbidden us to lie to our spouses. That's more tame. So it seems absurd to think that God could have just commanded us to always lie to our spouses, or to be unfaithful to them, or something like that. Well, sure, the reason that seems absurd to us is because that moral law is written on our hearts. Of course, any suggestion that things be otherwise is going to seem absurd. But if things were otherwise, and God did write the other rule on our heart, then it would not seem as absurd. It's only absurd because reality is, in fact, not that way. So that's where that argument gets its force. But besides that, I would argue that it's... And so my point here is the fact that it seems arbitrary, that it leads to counterintuitive results, is not a good argument against divine command theory. And besides that, suppose it is arbitrary. Suppose a rule that God makes is arbitrary. Would it be any less binding? It doesn't seem to me that it would be. I mean, if God is a legitimate authority and he makes a rule, even if the rule is arbitrary, it would seem to me that it would still be just as binding. So I don't think that horn of the dilemma is as problematic as people think it is. But that being said, I don't think it's a true dilemma anyway. I think it's a false dilemma. Because if you think about it, I'm a compatibilist, and a compatibilist is somebody who thinks that all of your actions, everything you do on purpose, is determined by antecedent desires, preferences, or beliefs, or whatever. It's basically your mental states. Your prior mental states determine your choices and stuff like that. And so anything God does, he does it because of his character, his nature, just the way God is, his personality. That all determines his behavior. And so all of his commands are determined by the way he is. And so it's not arbitrary. And as we argued in the second cosmological argument, God is a necessary being. And if God is a necessary being, then he could not have been otherwise. And so whatever character he has that determines the morals that he imposes on us, they could not have been otherwise. And so that means that they're not actually arbitrary, and they don't simply exist because God arbitrarily chose them. They're just the outflow of his nature, which is the standard of goodness. I think that is just about all I had to say. It is. I'm sure there's more I could say. I'm going to go ahead and leave some more links to my blog in the description, but that's all I had to say for today, and that's all I had to say for the moral argument, I think. Unless I come up with something else, that's it. Thanks for coming. What do you know? Just a few seconds later, and I already came up with something else I wanted to say. There's this argument that goes on the internet sometimes about whether or not there could have just been an evil God instead of a good God, or maybe an evil God and a good God. Like in, I think, Zoroastrianism, they have two gods, one good and one evil. Couldn't that be the case? Well, if you had two gods like in Zoroastrianism, then there couldn't be, I mean, good and evil would be kind of interchangeable. You know, what's to say that something is good or evil when they could just, be reversed? I know I'm not explaining that well. I've explained it better in written stuff. But, I mean, the only way there can be a good is there has to be one absolute standard of goodness. Good and evil are not equal and opposite things. Goodness is what ought to be. Evil is a deviation from that. So you can have a violation of a rule. You can have a set of rules or a set of standards and stuff without having a violation of those standards, but you can't have a violation of standards without the standards. And so good is more of a positive thing, whereas evil is like a negative thing. I think Augustine described it as like good having positive ontological status and evil just being a departure or lack of goodness. But yeah, I guess that's all I'm going to say. I don't want to go into all that. But basically, my ontological argument for the goodness of God seems to address that argument, this idea that there could have been an evil God. Because if God prefers something and imposes obligations on people, then that's the way things are supposed to be. That's the purpose and stuff. And so I don't see how you can make sense of that with an evil God. I guess you could have an evil God saying, well, here's everything I want you to not do, but do it. I mean, does he prefer evil? If he prefers evil, then he's going to command you to do evil. But if he's commanding you to do evil, is it really evil? It would be good in that case, wouldn't it? Because he's I mean, this thing with authority is telling you what to do. That's the thing to do. That would be good, right? So I don't think it makes sense to say that there's a supreme evil God. There has to be, if there's a supreme God, if there's this moral rule that defines what goodness is, or that distinguishes between good and evil, then the God that all this depends on would have to be a perfectly good God. Couldn't have any evil in him at all. And so I think the next thing I'm going to address is the problem of evil in the next video, unless I come up with more stuff to say about the moral argument.